There we go. All right. We are going to start tonight and kind of get back on our minor prophets schedule. We took a break and now we're going to be looking at the prophet Habakkuk or Habakkuk or however you might have learned to pronounce it. I already got feedback this last week from talking about Baal or Baal and all these things. It's impossible to know which one that they all are, but as long as we can all say it and know who we're talking about, I feel good. And we're going to be looking at Habakkuk. That's how I always learn to say it, so I'm rolling with it. And as we jump into this book, we're going to find that Habakkuk's book of prophecy is kind of different. It's centered around a set of questions directed to God by Habakkuk, and then the Lord's recorded answers back to him that he wrote down. And so it's kind of unique in its structure as we go through that with this question and answer format as we do it. And so I wanted to ask, just getting going, because that's kind of unique, are there, or I guess in your own faith life, have you felt comfortable asking questions of God? Sandy says yes. I've met some people for whom that's kind of a no-no, where it's just like, you take with faith and there's kind of a stoic acceptance of this is just God's got a plan. This is how it is. And so you move forward with it. Does anybody mind sharing, if not the specifics, but the kind of questions you have asked of God? Are they just the big ones? Is it the big and the small, just whatever it might be? How does that aspect of the relationship and faith work out for you?
All the above, and sometimes there's answers and sometimes there's silence.
Okay. So big and small questions answered and non-answered sometimes.
I always ask questions like, how come this is like this? Why did this work out this way? How come? How come this isn't some other way? What do you think about this?
Yeah.
I mean, God doesn't want to tell me those answers to those questions. But I'm careful about asking those questions.
Okay.
I've asked them a massive amount of time in my life.
Okay. That's fair.
I ask questions like, what am I supposed to do here? What
Okay.
am I, what's the direction I'm supposed to take? What am I
Mhm.
supposed to say to this person or do in this situation?
Yeah.
Well, I ask if there's other universes and this alien things and
Yeah.
whatnot.
That's a
And then
good
we can talk
question.
to them about stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
So I mean, like, we're getting kind of this broad swath of questions that we ask, which is kind of interesting, of like the big questions, metaphysical stuff, of just like that big, broad kind of question, the uber specific. I'm in this moment. What do I do? What do I say? The questions that are almost in the middle in my world, in my life right now. Why did this thing go the way it's going? Why did that happen? Why is this thing happening? I find for myself, I tend to be kind of stoic in just taking things. I feel bad sometimes. I feel like I live at times an unexamined life. Like things will happen and I just kind of take them at face value. And I'm like, okay, like that's what today is. That's what's going on. That's the thing, whether it's good or bad. Mandy always gets frustrated because she's the emotional thermometer. You know what I mean? Like just whatever the temperature is, she's up, she's down, she's feeling everything like that. And she used to get frustrated with me, still does occasionally in our marriage, because whatever's going on, I'm kind of this person. So it's like a great thing can happen. And I'm like, that's really great. And that's kind of my response. It's like, that's awesome. And something bad can happen and be like, well, it'll be okay. We'll get there. And it's just this. And so for her, she's like, you got to give me something, you're not giving me anything emotionally. But those questions, like the big questions and the small ones do pop up for me. They don't happen all the time because sometimes I'm just in the like, take it in as input and figure out what the output is. But occasionally they'll hit me and you just sit there, and mine tend to be more like Susan's, those ones of why in the world did this thing happen or that thing go on, or especially when we see things going on in the world. Like Russia and Ukraine was one where I just kind of sat there and I'm like, what is accomplished in this? And those kind of questions where something just feels, from my perspective, pointless. And that's where my questions come in, where I'm like, I just don't get it. I don't get how there's good. how the bad is worth the good that can come from this. I know God can make good come out of anything, but to me, sometimes it doesn't meet my math. And those are the moments where I'm like, I just don't know what to do with this.
I just want to say to you, no,
Yeah.
honesty and fairness to Mandy, maybe she doesn't do this, but it's hard for me anyway, I wish she was alive. Because I always thought he ought to have the answer to the things I wanted to know.
Mhm.
Because he's a preacher, right? He should be able to figure this out. He didn't say,
Yeah.
have all the answers. And fine, if I didn't enough, he'd say, Susan, do you remember what we talked about? God's got a plan. You don't know what it is, so you just got to be calm and wait to find out.
Yeah.
But I don't like that answer.
Yeah, it's never a fun one to receive. It feels very wise when you can give it, but then when you have to hear it, you're like, dang. And usually when we get started with one of these prophetic books, I think it's good to do a little bit of background to let us know where it is and what's going on. Timeline wise, Habakkuk is a prophet for the southern kingdom of Judea, that smaller kingdom. And he was probably a contemporary of not Isaiah. He's probably a contemporary of like Jeremiah and some others. You know, he had his place near the end of that kingdom. But again, as we've said with a lot of these minor prophets, we don't have a lot of detail. We don't know his family background, like, you know, Jonah, and we have him popping up in other places. Habakkuk doesn't show up in the narrative, really. We don't have a lot of background for him. What we do know is that his name comes from a Hebrew word, which means to struggle or to embrace, like to hold on to something in that kind of way, which kind of describes Habakkuk and his faith. It's an apt name. He's struggling with God. He's asking these questions of God, but ultimately, as we're going to see, he ends up just embracing and holding on to God's answers. So you have this kind of play on words with his name that happens so often with some of our Hebrew characters as we go through. And one of the things that really makes this book unique is the fact that almost always the prophets are speaking to a people. You know, hear the word of the Lord to whoever it might be. And there's this kind of like the prophet is the voice or the mouthpiece of God, bringing the word of the Lord to people who need to hear it. That is not Habakkuk. This is a recording of a conversation between Habakkuk and God. Nobody else is entering into this conversation as an audience other than those who read the book. He's not speaking to them. He's asking questions of God. God gives an answer. He asks another question of God. God gives another answer. And then he prays to God. That's the entirety of the book.
So he asks it and then writes down what he thinks God told him.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's interesting though, that you said, and when I look right there, I think it myself, that it's a question. My Bible says at the top of it, it's a complaint.
Well,
All the questions.
And is that the verse 1 there? Is it the complaint that Habakkuk?
No,
What about verse 3? Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble?
Oh, I see. Like the heading of it
Yeah,
says,
yeah, it says complaint, and the next one, second complaint. first
Yeah.
Complaint, second complaint.
well, we're going to see, because these questions definitely, if we had to give them a connotation, they are complaints to God. They are,
I'm not saying they are, I'm just.
No.
I think it's interesting
yeah.
that whoever did that part of the Bible. calls it a
Well,
complaint
and you know
or
what,
a question.
mine says justice is a joke.
That's-
Justice is a joke.
What
Who's
translation are you
commentary?
using?
Message.
Oh, the Message. Okay. Because those headings are interesting and how they break it up. Mine doesn't really do headings, so I don't get that kind of thing in mine. But those little interpretive paragraph headers to say what this is or what that is, you kind of see the interplay here of how we interpret this. Of it's a question for sure. It's all framed in the form of a question, but it is a complaining question to God. And the substance of it certainly kind of relies on that, like, hey, God, what's the deal?
Yeah.
Like, that's ultimately the question as we go through. And so his prophetic ministry, usually there's this direct proclamation or confrontation of that ministry. His is almost entirely introspective and reflective. He's looking at the world and then looking in his faith. And so it gives us a different aspect of it here. So we're going to jump into this first question and answer dialogue in the first chapter. I'll read the first 4 verses. I'll read Habakkuk's first complaint if we want to use that. And then we'll kind
I
of,
didn't mean we need to say that, I just.
it's a totally legitimate word to describe it, whichever way we do it. There's nothing wrong with it at all. But the prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received, and that prophecy is the same word we saw in the previous book with Nahum, where it's a burden. It's something heavy that's on his heart. It only gets used in these kind of, it's not good news prophecy when it's that burden. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. That's Habakkuk's prayer to God. In your own words, what's the content of this question to God, or this complaint, if we want to use that language?
It's not fair.
It's not fair.
How come here all this stuff's happening? It's not fair.
Yeah.
At least not what he wants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God's not doing anything right now. But when you say it's not fair, what's not fair?
All the trouble that's going on, and how many times do I have to yell, help, murder, police before you come to rescue? It's like,
Mhm.
there's all this not fair stuff and you're not fixing it.
Yeah. How about anybody else? If you had to give the cliff notes of this, if you had to give it the paraphrase here, what would it be?
It's like, why? I feel like it's almost like, why is there like violence and like all that kind of stuff like in general?
Mhm.
It's like why did you create this?
Yeah.
Like, why is this something we have to have anymore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially when it's like, yeah, it says the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails.
Yeah.
It's kind
Like
of a brutal verse.
it really is. And it sums up kind of the despair that he's feeling in this, because it's that really says this isn't a one-time, hey, my car got broken into. God, what gives? This is justice is broken. You know what I mean? Like only the bad stuff is working. The law is paralyzed. The law is accomplishing nothing around me right now. All I see is brokenness and nothing's working the way it works or should work.
Mine says the wicked have the righteous hamstrung.
That's
It's kind of,
yeah. Eugene Peterson has a good way with words. I like the message in that. Do you find yourself asking similar questions of God today?
I used to.
You used to.
I don't anymore.
Okay.
I feel like, yeah,
Yeah.
like it's like what you said too with like Ukraine and Russia. You're just like, why?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is this happening?
Yeah.
Why isn't justice prevailing?
Yeah. I think it's a fair question we can ask. One of the things that I take from this and that I've always really enjoyed, both in the prophets and in the Psalms, is the encouragement that we are allowed to ask those kind of questions of God. Because we're going to see God's answer, but his answer is not right after this. Who do you think you are to ask me a question? You sort of get that a bit with Job, but that's because Job was getting a little bit mouthy and testy with God, not just in a how long, oh Lord, but really trying to call God out for doing wrong. But in the prophets, God is strong enough in the relationship he has with us to weather those kind of questions and not become offended and say, well, if you're going to talk to me like that, I'm going to leave. God's willing to take on our anger when we bring that to him, when we're seeing stuff like this and we're talking and we're praying to him and like, I was watching an interview with a Ukrainian seminary student, and their seminary got bombed in Kiev. And he was saying, I pray for God to enact my revenge, that God would break the bones of my oppressors. And, you know, when we hear that, we're kind of like, you know, that doesn't sound very good. That doesn't sound very Jesus-like. But part of his thing was, I give it to God. I'm giving all of my revenge and that feeling to God and saying, this is on you. Because he said, if I do it, I know I'm doing wrong. So I lay this on God for him to do or for him not to do, but I'm going to bring my honest heart to him, that this is how I feel right now. And that's kind of the Habakkuk thing here. You know, it's that frustration and just that honest cry out to God saying, you know what? I have some notes. I'm frustrated at how things are going, and I'm frustrated that it feels like the wicked are hamstringing the righteous. Like, we can't win this race. We're being beaten on all sides as we go through.
I feel like if God can allow us to ask those questions,
Mhm.
then he's honoring the fact that we're coming to him and we believe that, I mean, he's saying, thanks for coming to me. That means that you think I can do something about it,
Yeah.
or that I matter.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so that's why I think he welcomes such a thing, because if God didn't matter, you wouldn't even do it.
Yeah. In doing premarital counseling, a book I used to read talked about the four horsemen of unhealthy relationships that lead to bad things. And the worst one, and something I've always taken away from that book, and Mandy and I use in our own marriage, is he says, fighting is not a sign of an unhealthy marriage. It's a sign of a healthy one, because you care enough to still be invested in convincing another person and being on the same page. He said the number one death knell is when the fighting stops. When you quit talking to each other because you just can't be bothered anymore. And you've already figured out that person, they're just not listening. It doesn't matter. You don't bring your complaints, your questions. You don't try to get on the same page. We're just coexisting. And he said, that's the number one signifier of we're in a really unhealthy place. More, you can have a knockdown, drag out, you're screaming at each other. That's better than the tense, cold silence that can exist. And I think the same thing is true, like what you're saying, in our relationship with God. God would rather us be fiery than just not even come. And in his answer here, it's really fascinating. And I want us to hear God's answer. And it's kind of astounding and amazing. And we know that because the first verse says, look, and then be amazed. But starting in verse 5, God's response to him is, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I want to stop for just 1 second, because I have heard this verse quoted and used so many times at the start of an evangelistic drive or a push of some sort of God's going to do a new and amazing thing. Just watch. It is nothing but good coming from here on out. God's got a plan. Because the next verse has always made me laugh when I hear anybody quote this verse in that kind of way. Verse 6, I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. So much for watch and be amazed, because good news is coming. It's kind of an astounding response from God that seems backwards. Habakkuk's complaint is, why is there injustice in the world and wickedness and violence that seems to magnify, and the righteous can't get one up? And God's response is, you ain't seen nothing yet. I am raising up a people that you know for their cruelty and their violence and their wickedness, and boy, are they coming. What kind of answer is that from God? Like, what in the world? It certainly caught in Habakkuk's ear, and it certainly caught in the people who read this as they, that's not the answer you're expecting after watch and be amazed, because I'm about to do something. I'm about to raise up a really awful people as we go through. What words does God use to describe the Babylonians here? If you just go through it, look for some verbs and some adjectives. Ruthless and impetuous.
Terrible and dreadful.
Terrible and dreadful.
Fierce.
Fierce.
Bloodthirsty.
Yours has bloodthirsty.
Yeah, that one.
Mine that they devour. they mock, they scoff, they laugh.
Yeah, you said an eagle, but in mine it says like a vulture.
Yeah, mine does.
Okay.
I feel like that's more like,
Yeah.
like eagles are cool. Vultures,
Yeah,
not that cool.
not as
I mean,
great.
they're cool, but they're like more like.
Like bad cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The connotation is a little closer, just
Yeah.
that negative, like,
So, yeah,
you see a vulture, that's bad news.
Exactly.
Things have gone wrong.
Yeah.
So why would God raise up this group in response to Habakkuk's complaint? How is this an answer to what he's doing? He's bringing these people up. Why is he bringing them up? I guess is the question. What do y'all think?
So they can fall harder.
So they can fall harder? What do you guys think? It's a weird one. I'm looking up this in my another translation here as well. Does anybody else have any thoughts? It's a weird question, I know.
Kind of to get his attention, boy.
Yeah, definitely to get his attention. And I think that would definitely work.
Will you still believe in me?
Mhm.
Testing them kind of.
Yeah. Part of the complaint that Habakkuk has is not about foreigners who are doing this. That the law is paralyzed and the wicked are surviving and doing all this. Part of Habakkuk's complaint is about the Judeans and their injustice that's going on around them. And
How we feel in our country split divided right now.
yeah, there's that kind of feeling of like that not everybody is on the same page. We kind of have that Star Trek mentality. We think you come down to the planet and there's one person who speaks for everybody and we all agree. It's never how it works. There were factions and groups, and he's seeing that wicked factions grow and thrive and take root everywhere. And God's response is, I'm sending the Babylonians, who we know in his lifetime are going to conquer Jerusalem and Judea and lead everybody off into exile. That seems like a pretty bad answer, or at least a bad news answer as we go through. In that last verse, that they sweep like the wind and go on against guilty people whose own strength is their God. This idea of the own strength as their God is not talking about the Babylonians as much as it's talking about the people who they are sweeping over and just conquering as they go through. I don't like the new NIV translation of that. I think it's a little not as clear as it is in others, which is why I was trying to find one where they say like who go on against these guilty people whose own strength is their God. There's kind of a phrasing there that I think is a little bit better. And God is going to use this people. That's his answer to Habakkuk is God is using this. God is using them as they're going through and they're conquering. That Judea is going to be conquered. This wicked group that he's complaining about, God says, I'm bringing up an even worse group to work on them and to take them out. What is interesting about this to me is the fact that the Babylonians are not saying, come, let us go and conquer Judea for their sins against Yahweh. That's not how this is working. They have no interest in God, but God is using them in spite of their self-centered interests and their ambition and their cruelty and their greed in order to achieve his purpose in the world. For me, that is both a severe challenge and also something of a comfort that God can use anything that's going on, including the folks that are not interested in being used by God to accomplish what God wants to do in the world. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? I mean, we think about it and we can see the aspects of that even in the New Testament. You know, the Romans weren't planning on serving God's purpose when they arrest and crucify Jesus. They weren't planning on helping to provide the means of salvation for the entire world, but they're a part of that purpose. They didn't intend, Judas certainly didn't intend to be doing God's will when he's betraying Jesus, but that's the way that it all ended up going as far as accomplishing the purpose that God had in mind. The Romans, they arrest Paul as he's preaching the gospel. They're certainly not thinking he's going to write a letter now that'll be read by billions over the next 2 millennia. But that's exactly what happened. People can be used by God to achieve the purposes that he's got going, even when they're not thinking about it.
but should you throw your support behind those people then? I'm likening this to probably the political realm right now.
Okay.
And I shouldn't do that, but if God has a purpose, and he is using people that
Mhm.
are wicked, are we supposed to be supportive of God's plan?
I think God can use those guys on their own.
Yeah, we don't
I don't
have
think
to,
we need to
we
help
don't
them.
have to support.
We don't have to help them.
Yeah.
That's just
Yeah.
just saying.
Well, what do y'all think?
I mean, I don't support any politicians.
A safe bet.
Yeah, that's why I agree. God can do his thing.
Yeah.
You know, I'll let him handle that part because I just can't trust anything.
So
going
you
on
don't
there.
vote?
Not really. I mean, okay, I voted in the last election, but I'm gonna vote local. And the
Yeah.
next one, sorry.
That's
we got
good,
political
because you
session.
are more aware of who those people
Yes,
might be.
Yeah.
exactly. And they actually directly affect me, but I'm not planning on running for president, especially
Yeah.
after the last one.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
I think thinking about this, the problem with saying God's got a plan, so do I support? We don't know which part is God's plan, unless we've got that discernment and we've got the vision like Habakkuk is getting from God here. And so saying, well, I'll throw my weight behind this person or that person, we throw our weight behind God. And we say, I'm trying to do what God tells me to do
Right.
in this moment. And he's going to use this person and that person. He can I had a professor once talk about it like God's plan. It's like improv jazz. You know what I mean? Somebody does something and he says, I can play off that. I can work with that. I can make that part of my plan and do a thing with it here. And then somebody else does something. And he said, wasn't what I would do, but I can work with that and turn it into something good. And he can do that. And I mean, we see it from humanity killing God becoming the method that salvation is offered to the whole world. That's a pretty amazing piece of improv in the sense that we try to do the most evil thing that humanity could do. And God said, I can use that actually. I can make that the most holy moment in all of human history. I can do it. And so in the midst of the bad things that are happening, we say, all right, God's got a plan and he can work through anybody who's doing this. But for us, and we have the hindsight of the gospel and all this, for Habakkuk, it's pretty frustrating still. And his response to God is equally frustrated, I think, and we can hear it as he says this coming after. Because starting in verse 12, and it goes down through the first verse of chapter 2, and I want to read this. He says, Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. So he's seeing part of this plan. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? That's a fair set of questions that Habakkuk asked God. He complains about wickedness, and God says, I'm raising up a people to punish the wicked in the world. And they're even more wicked, but they'll be used. And his response is, how does that make sense? I see what you're doing. And he's starting with praise. I know who you are. You are from everlasting. You will never die. You know what you're doing, but how can you tolerate the treacherous? And I love that verse. How are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Habakkuk's giving some notes to God here. Even better than the wicked wiping out the wicked. Wouldn't it be better if you raised up the righteous to do that? Like, wouldn't that be more in tune with what it feels like the plan ought to be?
God, don't you know anything?
Yeah, I mean, like, God, I love what you're doing, but I have some thoughts if you got a minute. He's kind of giving them like, why don't you raise up? Like, we're here, we're waiting on you. Why are you going to bring in, this is the old woman who swallowed a fly. We're making it worse by what we're swallowing here. Isn't there a better way? And that's not exactly what God has in mind here. And the vision that he uses definitely, I think, clicks for us as Cordovans, that the people of God, he says, the people in the world are like the fish in the sea. And essentially he's saying these Babylonians are running hooks through our mouths. They're catching us in their nets, and they are emptying their nets as fast as they can fill them. We are watching this wicked nation thrive and win battle after battle and war after war, and they are growing. I mean, he's writing this at a time that that empire is expanding faster than anybody can draw the map. And his response here is just, how are they supposed to just keep on emptying their nets, destroying nations without mercy? Is that the end goal here? Is that the plan, God, that they're just gonna wipe everything out and you wipe them out and that's the ball game? That's depressing. That's frustrating if that's the end of it. And God's response to that is his lengthiest of all of his responses to Habakkuk's questions. This frustration with his plan, or at least how it's lining up. And Habakkuk ends, and I love it. He says, I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. He's frustrated, but he says, I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait for an answer on this. I need an answer, and I'm just gonna be patient for it, which I think we lose sometimes if we listen and we say, oh, I didn't get an answer. All right, moving on, just to figure it out. He says, this is one I'm gonna sit and wait on the ramparts. You know, I'm watching the Babylonians come. I'm gonna sit here and wait until I have an answer from you. And the Lord replies, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest. Because he is as greedy as the grave and like death is never satisfied, he gathers to himself all the nations and takes captive all the peoples. Will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion? How long must this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey. Because you've plundered many nations, the people who are left will plunder you. For you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they're drunk, so he can gaze on their naked bodies. You will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you, for you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? It is covered in gold and silver. There is no breath in it. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. God's answer is really long here, but it begins with an encouragement for Habakkuk and then for everybody who hears his answer to understand. The first two verses. What does God tell Habakkuk to do right at the beginning in verse 2? Write it down and make it plain. Tell my answer exactly what it is so that a herald can run with it, is what my translation says here. Or so that whoever reads it is another way to translate that, may run with it. What is he telling them there? Like, what does that mean?
Let it be known.
Let it be known?
What your answer is. Make sure people know what I tell you.
Yeah,
For generations to come.
Yeah.
Let it spread.
let it spread. The message of God's plan and salvation, as complex as this world is, he's like, make it plain. Simplify it, because the plan is simple enough that somebody with a tablet should be able to run and yell it and make it make sense. That God's got a plan as he goes through. And the next encouragement he gives here is one that I think is important, where he says, the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of an end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. That almost sounds like an oxymoron. Though it linger, and then right after that, he says it will not delay. But the fact is, this is where we're talking about God's plan does not delay, even though from our perspective, it seems to linger, you know? Then we have that moment where we say, how long, God? And God says, just long enough. I've got I'm raising up my peoples and I'm working out my plan right now. You don't see all the pieces moving on the board like God does. And so there's this encouragement. It's coming. My plan is coming. My work is being done. And even if it feels like it's waiting too long, it's on its way right now as we go through. And right after all that, he gives this, what are called the 5 woes in Habakkuk 2 here. What are they here? We'll just go through them super fast. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. The person who robs others and steals for their stuff. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, not just himself, but now his home, his family, and his legacy built up with injustice. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Now it's not just a man or just his family, but now a town, a community, a city that's been built on that same unjust foundation. And then him who gives drink to his neighbors until they're drunk so that he can gaze at their naked bodies. This idea of enticing others to sin through whatever vice kind of exists in the world at the time. And then finally, woe to him who says to wood, come to life. Talking about this idea of these false idols as we go through. Is God talking about the Babylonians here, or is he talking about the Judeans and the Israelites? Who are these woes directed at? The Judeans. Okay. Why do you say them instead of the Babylonians here? Or is it both? Is it, I mean, what do you think?
If anybody that's these things that he's describing.
Okay.
If the Judeans are that way, it's them. If it's the Babylonians, it's them. Just a thought. God's picture for this is bigger. We tend to want to pick sides. You know, there's a war going on between the Babylonians and the Judeans. Whose side is God on? He says, woe to you both if this is how you're building your cities and making your money. You know, the Judeans, you've raised up your towns with injustice. It's not going to last long for you. And to the people who overcome you, the Babylonians, woe to you too, if that's how you're doing it. We tend to have this picture where we want to answer these questions, Habakkuk's questions, in the super short term. And we want to say, whose side is God on? We do the same thing. We're talking about, we don't want to get into politics. Is God on the side of the left or the right? Is God on the side of conservatives or liberals, progressives? Or we can always play this game. Whose side is God on? How should we be doing? How should we be acting? The fact is, God's bigger than our sides. And he's kind of saying, like, to them, we expect God to say, I'm on the side of the Judeans here. And say, woe to them too. And then woe to the people who overtake them. And then the people that overtake them if they don't do it in God's way. Because God's plan is not finding the least evil of all the options. He says, I'm working for a good. And that's what I'm aiming for as we go forward here. And so I think part of the lesson that we get, that's much, if I lean back, I don't get the sun. That's a nice thing.
If we take the message of Habakkuk, I think one of the lessons that we can take from it is the sense that God's justice is very patient. And that God is not trying to find the best of bad options in this world. He's working for a perfect plan in the midst of it. And he's willing to let that roll to some extent for his purpose and for his glory as it goes through. But what else do we see or do we hear in the midst of this? What do you hear in all this? We've read 2 chapters of Habakkuk tonight. What's God telling you? What lesson sticks out or what truth sticks out here in the midst of it? I'm not looking for anything in particular. I'm at the end of my notes. I just want to know what you guys think.
Well, I have highlighted it because
Yeah.
one of my favorite verses is, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge
Yeah.
of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea.
That is a good one.
And it's very hopeful.
It is, isn't it? In the midst of all these woes, you get this picture of why it's a woe, which is really awesome. Yeah, that is a pretty fantastic verse right there. And also earlier in this, you get another one that gets quoted 3 times in the New Testament in his response. The enemy is puffed up, his desires are not upright, but verse 4, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. What does that mean for us here? I mean, we come to it with Paul mentioning it and others, we kind of come to it with our own reading of it. But what does it mean? What does it mean to you here? What does it mean to Habakkuk as he's recording it and saying it?
I think it means that God is bigger than this stuff and he has a plan and we'll use it.
Mhm.
Be faithful and trust in truth and
Yeah.
the truth that God will. Might be a while
Mhm.
and there might be a few bumps in the road, but God will prevail.
Yeah.
Well, mine references John 3:36. He who believes in the Son has everlasting life, and he who does not believe the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God shall be upon him.
Mhm.
So
The-
we should be living by faith.
We should be living by faith. And I like the idea that faith here is being contrasted with somebody whose desires aren't upright and who's arrogant and never at rest. Faithfulness is being contrasted with a restlessness and with personal and selfish ambition and with unjust or unholy desire. That faithfulness is the choice that we make to live in a different way, to seek something else. It's not just the belief we say, I intellectually believe that Jesus died on a cross for my sins. It's I don't want to, this is where I get into stuff of like, that is important. That is hugely important.
But it's only
It's-
one little teeny.
It's
tiny
the
fraction.
first step on a very long road. And if you just say, I made a decision, I said a prayer, and then I wrote a date in my Bible, I am saved. I am good. Faith is a lot more than that, and we sell it short when it's being contrasted here. If that faithfulness means more than just an intellectual assent to a spiritual truth, it's reorienting our life and our heart to what God has desired for us. And in the midst of that, I hear that, delight yourself in the Lord and he'll give you the desires of your heart. When I was a brand new Christian, I thought that was like the Indiana Jones verse. I want the Ark of the Covenant so that I can win all my battles. Like, what if you have a bad desire of your heart? You just delight in the Lord and you can get it. Like, I can go get a yacht. I can go get whatever. Like, this feels like a loophole in the gospel. This feels like a bad plan. And what, in talking with others and in my own faith kind of growing, I think the key here is more of the idea that like when we delight in the Lord, the desires of our heart change. It aligns to his. We are transformed by the renewing of our mind. Our hearts are different. And I think that's part of what this faithfulness is. Faithfulness doesn't live here. Faithfulness lives in our heart, and it lives in how we live and how we choose what we do and how we face the circumstances that are going on in the world, like Habakkuk is. He's at a time of transition and turmoil and pain and fear. And instead of just watching and saying, let's build up a bigger, better army, after all, we're God's people, we can win. He's sitting there saying, God, help me, give me clarity before I go move, before I go do, as we go through. And I think another thing we can take out of this, if we take anything, is woe to us if our way of life and our world is built upon the injustice that is visited on others, or if it's built upon the suffering of others. That's one that I think is hard for us as Americans to hear sometimes, because our world and our comfort is often predicated on other people not feeling very comfortable. I order from Amazon and I get it in 5 days, and I don't have to think very hard about what process leads. And that's in Alaska. If I was, back in Florida, I get it same day or next day, depending on what time I order it. That kind of radical convenience comes at a very heavy personal cost for others, And if our city and our way of life is built upon suffering, God doesn't have good things to say about that community or society. And I think that speaks to slavery in our world. It speaks to economic injustice in our world. It speaks to a lot of exploitation that maybe we are not always quick to condemn because we just don't see it.
Or to even see,
Yeah, we've become very good at shielding that part of it, and we get.
Wow.
Yeah, I can buy the new phone every year when it comes out. I don't care where the lithium comes from. I don't care who's having to get that and do it. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have to ask those questions or think about it. And so I think there's a part of this that is that self-reflective, which is all of this book is reflecting in and then reflecting up. What are you calling me to do? I don't think there's an easy answer to those questions, but I think we got to be asking them like Habakkuk is. We got to be willing to at least challenge ourselves in that. Are there any other thoughts or reflections that you've got on Habakkuk so far? I know we're near the end of our time here. There's a lot in this book. I've been blown.
Well, I guess,
Yeah, Chris.
I guess for me, it's like, those times when he's silent, and you ask the questions and he's still silent,
Mhm.
that, there is a plan, and you do have to trust and have the faith that there is a plan, and it's always for good for us. And yeah, just to be more patient, and even when he's silent.
Yeah. Patience as we wait for an answer is a much easier thing said than done. But yeah, I think there's an absolute word of that in the midst of this. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. Anybody else have any thoughts as we are wrapping ourselves up? There's something on your mind or your heart that you say, well, also this is here. I like leaving that space. Y'all say things I never thought of in a million years as we do this, in a good way. But next week, we're going to look at Habakkuk 3, which is this prayer that Habakkuk gives in response to these answers and in response to his own situation and his world. And I think it's really, I see a lot of Job in the midst of this book, just this questioning and then acceptance of who God is and what God's done and that faith that comes from that. And so I'm really looking forward to that. So if you're able to come next week, and we're going to look at that. But I think there's a lot here that is just an encouragement to us in the midst of those questions that we ask, things that are going on in the world, wars or personal strife or personal struggle. God doesn't let the injustice get the final word, even when it feels like it does in the world. Even when the Babylonians are winning, it seems like every day, God says, I have an answer for it all. Just trust me as it's going through it. So I hope that's an encouragement in this for you. I know it is for me. But let me say a prayer and we'll close out and then get back together next week as we go through. Father, we thank you for your faithfulness in meeting us in your word. We thank you for the spirit that you give us that helps us to understand and decipher your word. Continue to open our hearts and minds to your truth. Help us to see and feel your truth as we not only look into the pages of scripture, but as we look into this world that you've created and the people who are in it. Help us to be humble enough to find your truth all around us and in voices that we would least expect, because we know that your spirit abides in us all and that you have created us out of love and full of your glory and your image. So be with us this week as we go out into the world and help us to proclaim your love, your truth, and your gospel to all who need to hear it. We love you and we praise you, Father. Amen.
Amen.
All right, I'm going to lean forward and be completely blinded. Pull this over here. God bless you, Chris.